You know the story, right? Adam, the first man, is all alone in the Garden of Eden. So God takes one of his ribs and creates Eve, the first woman. I mean, this story is foundational for billions of people. But what if a tiny, central piece of that story, just a single word, has been misunderstood for centuries? Think about it. The entire dynamic of humanity's first relationship, how we understand it, could totally change based on this one question. Is it possible that the word we've always read as rib actually means something completely different, and maybe a whole lot more profound? So the version we all know comes straight out of Genesis chapter 2. God puts Adam into a deep sleep, takes one of his ribs, and boom, fashions a woman from it. It's a simple, really powerful image. But is it the right one? To figure that out, we've got to go back to the original language. And this is where we get to the heart of it all. We're going to do a little linguistic digging. We're going to look at the original Hebrew word that got translated into rib and see how it's used everywhere else in the Bible. All right, so the word we're talking about is tselah. Now in Genesis 2, verse 21, it's translated as rib. But as you're about to see, that specific choice makes this verse a huge, huge outlier. And here's where it gets really interesting. This is the only place in the entire Old Testament where tslah is translated as rib. Every single other time, it's used to describe the side of something, the side of the Ark of the Covenant, the side of the tabernacle, even the side of a hill. It always means a whole structural side, not just one little bone. Now, in the source material for this explainer, Dr. Robert Vannoy admits that translating tselah here is tricky. He basically says that while rib isn't impossible, it's probably way more specific than the original Hebrew ever intended. The much, much more common meaning, based on all the other evidence, is side. So what's the big deal? Rib, side, does it really matter? Well, it turns out it matters a lot. This one little linguistic shift has huge theological implications, and it completely reframes the relationship between the first man and woman. And this idea gets even stronger when you look at another key word, helper. When God says he'll make a helper for Adam, our modern ears might hear something like assistant or, a subordinate. But the source lecturer points out that the original Hebrew phrase really means something more like a help equal and adequate to himself, a partner who perfectly corresponds to him. And this is where it all just clicks into place. See, if Eve was created not from a single small bone, but from Adam's entire side, the symbolism completely changes. She isn't some minor part of him. She is his equal, taken from his side to stand at his side. This stops being a story about hierarchy and becomes a story about partnership. Okay, so this new interpretation doesn't just change how we see Adam and Eve. The source we're looking at argues that it actually provides the foundational blueprint for marriage, for relationships, and maybe even for the unity of all of us. Right after Eve is created, the text says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." This isn't just happening, it's an explanation. It's like the narrator is pausing to tell us, hey, this is why marriage exists. It's to restore that original unity. They were literally one, and in marriage they get to become one again. To take this even broader, the source quotes the philosopher Francis Schaeffer. He argues that this account, where all of humanity comes from one unified source that's then differentiated, is what gives so much strength to the idea that all of humanity is really fundamentally one big family. Now, taking this interpretation literally, that humanity began this way, well, it has consequences that ripple out way beyond just theology. The source argues that it puts it in direct conversation with the modern scientific debate on our origins and actually poses a challenge to Darwinian evolution. And the lecturer is really clear on this point. A literal reading of Genesis, where humanity is this special, direct creation, just can't be squared with the theory of macroevolution, which says we gradually developed from simpler life forms over millions of years. The two ideas just don't fit. To support this perspective, the source brings in a really interesting voice, Sir Fred Hoyle. Now, what's fascinating here is that Hoyle was a famous astronomer and mathematician, and he wasn't a Christian. He argued that the whole idea of complex life just forming by chance in some primordial soup was a statistical absurdity. So this is the number Hoyle calculated for the probability of life just happening. That's a 1 with 40,000 zeros after it. You can't even wrap your head around that. He said the chances are so small that it would be ridiculous even if the entire universe were nothing but organic soup.
And Hoyle didn't stop there. He suggested a pretty provocative reason for why the theory sticks around despite those odds. He argued that if Darwinism wasn't socially desirable, it would have been tossed out by now. His claim is that its acceptance has as much to do with social preference as it does with hard science.
So, from the nature of partnership to the unity of all people, all the way to the debate over where we even came from, it all traces back. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much of what we believe about ourselves, our relationships, and our world rests on a single word choice, a rib instead of a side. It's a powerful reminder of how a simple interpretation can end up shaping our entire reality.